All right, everyone. So I want to talk to you guys about the 100 Years' War. I started reading this book on the 100 Years' War. It is called The 100 Years' War by Desmond Seward, and it is it's a small history book, and it gives you the basic facts of the 100 Years' War. It is Europe's longest conflict. I want to share with you guys some of the things that I read about and just give you guys my thoughts on it. 100 Years' War. And they say that it was longer than 100 years. They say that it was actually 116 years. And it was between the English and the French. The whole thing started with this question over who was going to inherit the throne of France. Who was going to be the heir to the throne after King Charles IV died? Was it going to be Philip of Valois, or was it going to be Edward III? You may be asking, Ted, why in the hell would an English king lay claim to the royal throne of France? Well, because the English and the French were really mixed up. In a way, England was an extension of French culture. It had been conquered by the Normans. It was conquered by William the Conqueror, who was Norman. He was French. The Normans came from France. Now, their ancestors, if you look deep enough, you'll find that their ancestors came from Scandinavia, but at this point, these guys were French, and the Normans conquered England, and they brought their French ways with them. That's why there are so many French words in the English language, a lot of French words. And so the royal families of England and France, they were tangled up. King Edward III was the son of Queen Isabella of France, who was the sister of the French King Charles IV, and after Charles IV had died, he left no male heirs, and this is the reason why the nephew of Charles IV, Edward III, said that he was the rightful heir to the throne, because the French king left no sons, so Edward III said, I'm his nephew. I am the rightful heir to the French throne. So Edward III was the nephew of King Charles IV, whereas Philip of Valois, he was the cousin of Charles IV. The English argument was that the nephew of the king should take precedence over the cousin of the king. And so Edward III said, I am the rightful heir to the throne. But the Frenchies didn't like that. No. The Frenchies did not like that. They did not like the idea of an Englishman being their king. So the French said, nope, Philip of Valois is our king, and they declared him to be king. So Edward III had to go to France to express his homage to the king of France, who was now Philip of Valois, or Philip VI. And so he went to France and he got on his knees and he said some expressions of respect. But Edward III gets up and in a very haughty manner, he just turns his back on the King of France and just walks right out. A show of utter disrespect. So there was all this tension building up. England at this time had a monopoly over wool production. England was the producer of wool in Europe, and the people of Flanders, well, they were cloth makers, and so they depended on that English wool. They needed that English wool. The problem was that the guy who was ruling Flanders, Louis de Nevers, he was an ally of Philip VI, and so he didn't like the English very much, and he was in fact persecuting English merchants. And he was arresting English merchants. So the King of England, Edward III, he says, who does this bastard in Flanders think he is? You know what? We're the ones who produce all this wool that your cloth makers make money from. We're going to punish the cloth makers of Flanders. And so he made a decree. No more wool may be exported to the Flemish. And there was another place, Brabant, or Brabant, however you want to call it. Brabant is now a part of Belgium, in what is now known as Belgium. And so the cloth makers of Brabant, they were still using the English wool. They were still at good terms with the King of England. But the rule was that the people of Brabant could use the wool of England as long as they didn't give any to the Flemish. So this was a pretty big deal. And now these cloth makers of Flanders, they were literally reduced to starvation, and they had to beg for a living. And so what happened was that the people of Ghent, another area in what is now known as Belgium, the people of Ghent, they elected a guy to rule over them. His name was Jacob de Artevelde. And Jacob de Artevelde, he ruled over Ghent, and he also ruled over Bruges and Ypres, or Ypres, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. And he was a harsh ruler. He put to death anyone who opposed him. There was a little insurrection that was going on in Flanders against Louis de Nevers, who was an ally of the French. Artevelde supported the insurrection, and he took over Flanders. So then he made an alliance with the King of England, and King Edward III said, okay, I will make an alliance with you guys. In return, I'll allow you guys to use English wool. So cloth makers were back in business in Flanders. And so you had these alliances that were being made within the 100 Years' War, and there was just all this tension that was building up. There was this region in southern France, it was called Guyenne. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it was called Guyenne. And Guyenne was ruled by the English. And Guyenne was a big wine-producing region. And so a lot of wine was being made there, and tons of wine was being exported. So there was a lot of money to be made. Well, King Philip VI, who was now the King of France, he wanted to unite all of France under his crown. And that meant getting rid of all the English, kicking the English out of Guyenne, and making Guyenne a part of France and no longer under the English. Much of the war was fought over this region in southern France. And there was so much bloodshed. I mean, this damn thing, the 100 Years' War, I mean, this thing lasted for, the title is self-explanatory, it lasted for 100 years, but you will also read that it lasted for 116 years. So it lasted for over 100 years. Over 100 years of just warfare. Bloody warfare. King Edward III, just to give you guys some more perspective on who he was, I'm sure all of you guys have seen the film Braveheart. I'm sure all of you guys have seen this movie, Braveheart. Well, remember in the movie Braveheart, the son of Longshanks was a homosexual. Well, the son of Longshanks was Edward II. So Longshanks was Edward I, then his son, the weirdo who was in Braveheart, whose boyfriend Longshanks threw out the window, his son was Edward II. And then that guy's son was Edward III. So the son of Longshanks' homosexual son was Edward III, who would fight against the French in the beginning stage of the 100 Years' War. And so what happened with Edward III was that he didn't want to be like his dad. If you read about his father's reign, the gay guy in Braveheart, if you read about his reign, he was a failure of a king. And I think to this day, he is considered to be England's worst king. The worst. So you had Longshanks, brutal, but he got the respect of his people, and he got the respect of all of the English elites around him. Because Longshanks, he was extremely fierce. He was a very fierce king, very intimidating. They say that Longshanks was so intimidating and so fierce that a man wanted to talk to him to request that he lower the taxes that he was imposing on the people, something like that. And he approached Longshanks, and Longshanks turned around to face him. And they say that Longshanks' face was so scary and so fierce that this man died from fear. He died from terror. That's how horrifying this guy was. And he was very brutal with the Scottish. I read about how in one battle with the Scots, he took over a Scottish city and he killed 10,000 people just like that. His son came out to be the opposite of his father. His son, Edward II, was really not interested in war. He wasn't. I mean, he wasn't interested in war. And he had this guy that was with him. His name was Pierre Gaveston. Now, Pierre Gaveston was a man who was an expert in the arts of war, the use of arms, things like that. He was an expert in hand-to-hand combat. So Longshanks, Edward I, he was very impressed with Pierre Gaveston's sword skills. And so he thought that Pierre Gaveston would be an excellent influence for his son, Edward II. Well, it turned out that Edward II and Mr. Gaveston got very, very, very close. Like, really close, to the point where Edward II wanted to give out entire lands to Mr. Gaveston. And in one story that I read, Longshanks' son approached him, his dad, he approached Longshanks, and he said, "Dad, I want to give this county or this territory to Mr. Gaveston." And Longshanks was so mad at his son that he leaped on top of his son and he pulled out entire chunks of hair from his scalp. So the movie Braveheart was accurate in the sense that Longshanks was beating up his son because he didn't like the route that his son was going. He didn't like how his son was just under this immense influence of Gaveston to the point that he was willing to give out an entire county to Mr. Gaveston. And in the film Braveheart, Longshanks hates the fact that his son is so influenced by this guy. If you read the history, you'll find that this sort of thing was happening, that Longshanks' son was just dangerously attached to this Mr. Gaveston guy. And medieval chroniclers at that time wrote of how Longshanks' son was a homosexual. When you read the stories, I think that what those medieval writers were saying made sense, because those two were horrendously close. Longshanks' son was indeed married to French royalty. He married this French princess named Isabel, and she was the daughter of Charles IV. So what happened was Longshanks died. So Longshanks, he hated this Gaveston guy. He's this guy, this member of Sodom, has had way too much influence over my son. I want to get rid of this guy. So he was expelled from having any sort of contact with his son. What happened was, after Longshanks died, his son brings Gaveston back. He brings Pierre Gaveston back. He says, "Oh, Pierre, come back over here." So Pierre Gaveston is back with the royal family of England, and he is, like when Longshanks was alive, having this horrendous influence over Longshanks' son, who was now Edward II, King Edward II. Well, King Edward II was such a lousy king that Robert the Bruce, who's also in the film Braveheart, Robert the Bruce devastated much of northern England. That's why they say this guy was the worst king in English history. The worst king. So the elites in England, they said, "Listen, we got to get rid of this king and his boyfriend, Mr. Gaveston. We got to get rid of this guy." So they did a little revolution against Longshanks' son, and they tried to physically remove them from any sort of position of power. They tried to remove the King of England. So what happened was, Edward II, he ran away. A whole crowd of people came. I want to say that they surrounded, or they attacked the castle that Edward II and Mr. Gaveston were living in, were residing in. And so they ran away. Edward II ran away, and then Gaveston, he runs away. Well, they captured Gaveston. And they hated this guy so much that they took him to the side of some road, and they just chopped his head off. They hated this guy. They despised him so much that they refused to give him a proper burial. And his body was sitting there on the side of some road in England, rotting. And Edward II, he didn't even know about it immediately. He found out later on. And when he found out, he gave Gaveston a proper burial. The thing is that to this day, we have no idea where Gaveston's tombstone went. We don't know what happened to it. That's how despised and forgotten this guy was. Edward II's wife, she hated him. She hated her husband. Like in the film Braveheart, Queen Isabella, this member of French royalty, this French princess, in the film Braveheart, she hates her gay husband, Edward II, so much that she gets banged by William Wallace. Now, that didn't happen in real life, but what did happen in real life was that Queen Isabella was getting banged by some English nobleman by the name of Roger Mortimer. But she has a son, Edward III, but he's way too young to be a kingly ruler. So Roger Mortimer, he ends up becoming effectively the king of England. So when the boy becomes of age, when he becomes of fighting age, he says, "This dude thinks he's the rightful heir to the throne. I'm going to get rid of him." So his mom, Isabel, and Roger are in their bedroom, and Edward II, the grandson of Longshanks, Edward III, the grandson of Longshanks, the son of Edward II, he gets an axe, goes into his mom's room while Roger is in there. He goes in there with his friends, and he says, "Mom, we're going to kill Roger Mortimer." Well, she begs her son not to kill him. And her son says, "No, Mom, he has to die." And they take Roger Mortimer and they killed him. They had him executed. That's how Edward the Third ends up becoming the King of England. So he eventually lays claim to the throne of France because the French king, Charles IV, he dies. Well, he has a wife named Joanne Evreux, I think her name was, and she's pregnant. And so before he dies, he says, if the child is a girl, then you got to give the throne to someone else because they're not going to give the throne to a lady. So now the fight was, who's going to take the throne? Is it going to be the nephew of the king? Is it going to be Edward III? Or is it going to be Philip of Valois? The French don't want an Englishman to rule over them, so they pick Philip of Valois, and he becomes Philip VI. And so this tension was building up between the two. And one of the things that helped to build up this tension was the fact that there was a guy by the name of Robert of Artois. He was known to be a scoundrel. He was also known to be a sorcerer. His dad died, and he wanted to inherit some stuff from his deceased father, so he forges a will. He makes up a fake will. Well, this, of course, was illegal, and so the King of France, Philip VI, doesn't like this, and so he wants Robert of Artois to be brought to justice. Well, Robert of Artois eventually flees to England, and he becomes an ally of King Edward III. So King Edward III thinks, well, I got this powerful Frenchman who's now my ally, and when the King of France heard this, he said, the King of England accepts one of my enemies as his ally. And so the war really starts to break out. Now, one of the things also that was happening before the war broke out was French people going to England and slaughtering English people. It says here that in March 1338, Nicholas Behuchet and his sailors burnt all Portsmouth, save for the parish church and a hospital. A few months later, Hugh Quiret took 5 rich ships off Walcheren, including the great cog Christopher. A cog was a ship, by the way. Richly laden with money and wool, which had been built for Edward himself. In October 1338, Southampton went up in flames when Guernsey was occupied. The following year, the French raided from Cornwall to Kent, attacking Dover and Folkestone, putting the entire Isle of Wight to fire and sword, and even appearing in the Thames estuary. French warships became an increasingly serious menace to the vessels which took wool to Flanders. So England's biggest business at the time was wool. Wool was its biggest commodity, and the English had a monopoly over wool production. The French were now attacking the transport ships that were exporting wool to Flanders. So now they were seriously affecting England's major business. And so England said, we got to go to war. In fact, England was facing a full-scale invasion. Informed Englishmen had feared one by Philip's Crusader fleet as early as 1333, and the raids of 1338 to 1340 caused grim rumors to circulate among the coastal folk, tales of kidnapped Kentish fishermen being mutilated and then paraded through the streets of Calais were not without foundation. On March 23, 1339, Philip VI issued an ordinance for the conquest of England. So we talk about Joan of Arc. Oh, she saved the French against the English and all this. But the Frenchies, before Joan of Arc popped up, the Frenchies were causing a lot of problems. They were butchering English people. They were trying to ruin England's biggest commodity, England's biggest business, which would have devastated England's economy. So what the French were doing was absolutely a declaration of war. But the English also had some pretty nasty habits. And so it says here that the English had acquired nasty habits in their Scottish wars. And during the campaign, Edward wrote to the young Prince of Wales how his men had burnt and plundered, so that the country is quite laid waste of corn, of cattle, and of any other goods. Every little hamlet went up in flames, each house being looted and then put to the torch. Neither abbeys and churches nor hospitals were spared. Hundreds of civilians, men, women, and children, priests, bourgeoisie, and peasants were killed, while thousands fled starving to the fortified towns. So it caused a big refugee crisis. As I was reading the book, I was thinking to myself, you know, Europe had so many wars. People think that Europe is just this beacon of civilization, and to a great extent, it is a beacon of civilization. It definitely was back when it was Christendom. Imagine if all these wars that were happening in Europe, the 100 Years' War, or later on, the 30 Years' War. Imagine if all these things happening in Europe were happening right now, and we were living in the midst of the 100 Years' War, all right? And it was happening today, and it was not with swords, but with guns and tanks and things like that. You would be sitting there thinking, damn, those Europeans, my goodness, they're a bunch of savages. I mean, in a way, Europe was like Africa, riddled with wars, so much violence, so many wars and battles and massacres. You read about how English people were butchering French people and French people were butchering English people. Imagine if the 100 Years' War was happening in our own time and we were, 50 years into the war. We would be thinking, it's been 50 years and these people are still killing each other. What's going on? There's something wrong with Europe. The reason why, or one of the main reasons why people associate Europe with peace and Africa with war, or the Middle East with war for that matter, is because of the last 7 decades or so in which Europe has been enjoying really unprecedented peace. This unprecedented peace has been going on since the end of the Second World War. So 1945, September of 1945, World War II ended, and then the Europeans basically said, okay, we're not going to do this again. And they formed the EU eventually, and before that it was just an economic union, but eventually it became the European Union. The purpose of the European Union, I know people are going to disagree with me on this, but initially speaking, the purpose of the EU was to prevent another war happening in Europe. Now, besides the Balkans, and with the exception of what's been going on in Ukraine currently, Europe has, for the most part, enjoyed unprecedented peace. The amount of peace that we have seen in Europe since the end of the Second World War has never been seen in its history. Never. So because we've been seeing Europe in relative peace and harmony for the past 7 decades or so, and we see Africa still dealing with wars, is we think, yeah, Europe is civilized and peaceful. But if you were to go back to the 1300s, or to really any part of the Middle Ages, if you were to go back to the 30 Years' War that began in the early 17th century, you'd be thinking the same thing. You'd be thinking, damn, Europe is pretty savage. Another thing that the 100 Years' War did, it really made nationalism more and more pronounced in Europe. So, and it was going on in the beginning, but you see nationalism, the idea of nationalism, really beginning to take shape in Europe within the 100 Years' War. Well, Edward III wants to become the King of France, and yes, he is the nephew of Charles IV, who was the King of France, but he's English, and we don't want Anglo-Normans ruling over us. We want purely French people. So you see tribalism and nationalism taking shape in Europe, and by the end of the 100 Years' War, the distinct nationalisms between the French and the English were truly, truly sharpened and pronounced. And I mean, to this day, you go to France and they get pissed at you for speaking English. You can speak any language. If you speak English, they get mad. And I remember I was in Spain, and there were these Spaniards telling me they made this trip to France, and they started speaking English. And the French people there told them, listen, don't speak English. Where are you guys from? From Spain. Keep it Spanish. Speak Spanish. They don't like the English language. So, I mean, the tensions between the French and the English, it's been going on for centuries. This rivalry and this hatred. And the English are a lot cooler than the French. I'm pretty certain you can go to England as a Frenchman and speak French and people aren't really going to care. But if you go to France and speak English, it's an issue all of a sudden. And the war, the 100 Years' War, it was so brutal. And there was a major, major naval battle that took place. It was known as the Battle of Sluys, which took place in what is known as the Netherlands. And this was a major, major naval battle. You had hundreds of ships on the French side, hundreds of ships on the English side. The French were using ships that were built for war. And the English used ships that were called cogs. They were known as cogs. Cogs were not really built for war. Cogs were built for transporting goods. That's what they were built for. They were built for transporting goods. But the English really wanted to form a major armada, and they said, just take the merchant ships and make them into naval ships. So they put cannons on some of these ships, and the English were masters at archery. They had the infamous longbow, which actually did not come from England. The longbow had its origins in Wales, and the reason why it was so popular was because in one instance there was a battle, and this Welsh archer, I'm pretty certain he was Welsh, but it doesn't matter, this archer armed with the longbow fired at a church door, and the church's door was very thick, and he hit the door with an arrow using the longbow, and the arrow was able to pierce this thick wooden door. So this so impressed the English that the English said, okay, take that bow and maximize its production, replicate it. So they started using the longbow, and the longbow was not really known by the French at this time. It was known by the English and the Welsh, and it was definitely known by the Scottish, but it wasn't really known by the French. So the French were in for a surprise, and what the English did was they got all these cogs and they filled them up with archers, thousands of archers. And they had lots of men at war, very, very experienced fighters in war. And they put these guys, who they called men at arms. They called these warriors men at arms. And they put them in these ships known as cogs. The French had they definitely had tens of thousands of men. They had a way bigger army, naval army, than the English did. I'm pretty certain I read in this book that they had about 20,000 soldiers, but it could have been less than that. It was somewhere around there. It was definitely in the thousands upon thousands. And so the French really should have won. They had ships that were built for war, not built for spreading merchandise. They had way more soldiers than the English did in this battle. But the English won. Several reasons for this. One was that when the English sailed towards the French ships, the English went with the wind. They had the wind on their side, which meant that their ships had more force. The English fought the French going with the wind. The French fought against the wind, so their ships didn't have as much force. And the English rammed the French ships. And another thing that gave the English an advantage was the fact that the English ships were much taller than the French ships. Even though the French's ships were built for warfare, the English had these ships that were very tall, much taller than the French ships. And these English ships, known as cogs, had longbowmen, master archers. And so the archers were overlooking the French soldiers who were on their French naval ships. And the English archers were just taking these French guys out. Another reason why was, although the French had much more soldiers than the English did, the majority of the French soldiers in this battle were really inexperienced in warfare. There was a small elite fighting group amongst the French, but the majority of the French soldiers were not experienced in war. With the English army, the English had much more men at arms, much more warriors who were experienced in warfare, plus they had superior archery. And the English slaughtered the French. There was this one ship that the English side had. It was a ship that was filled with the wives of the knights. And I read in this book that the wives of the knights, they had their own ship, and they had this thought that during the battle, they would go and I think speak to the women of French royalty or something like that. I don't know what the hell they were thinking, but the French sunk that ship. And I don't know if the French knew that that ship had the wives of the English knights, but they shot that ship and that ship sunk, and all the women in that ship died. They drowned. And they say that you could hear the screams of these women, and so these English warriors, as they were fighting the French, they heard their women screaming, and that made them fight even harder. And they say that up to 20,000 French soldiers were slaughtered. And the water just became red. It became blood red, like the Nile River. It became blood red. And they say that so many men died from drowning, and that if you could swim, you were swimming in a pool of blood and carnage and guts. It was that horrific. And it was said at that time that if the fish could speak, they would be speaking French. That's how many French bodies were in the water. and the English had very few casualties in comparison to the French. The English lost between 400 to 600 men, whereas the French lost between 16,000 and anywhere from 16,000 to 20,000 soldiers. So the French were utterly devastated by this. Utterly devastated by this. And as all of you guys know, eventually in the 100 Years' War, there was Joan of Arc, and I haven't gotten to that point of the story yet, but Joan of Arc was seen as a prophetess. She claimed to hear the voice of the Virgin Mary, and she was only about 12 or 13 years old, and she inspired the French to fight against the English, because the English would eventually control much of France. And it was shocking, right? It shocked Europe, because the French were seen as the superior army in Europe. They were seen as the supreme military force in Europe at the time, and here were the English defeating the French and eventually controlling much of France, and the English did atrocities and were tyrants. And so Joan of Arc, she comes in and she says, God is on the side of the French. There you have it, 100 Years' War. An evidence that Europe can be really just as savage as any other place on Earth.